Welcome to Castle Talk, where we talk to writers and creators of today's genre worlds. I'm MacKenzie Cole, and tonight we're talking to Leanna Hieber. Leanna is an award-winning author, she's an actress, and an audiobook narrator. She's known for her work in Gothic fiction and paranormal nonfiction. I'm so excited to be chatting with you today. Welcome, Leanna.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for letting me talk about all the hats I wear.
Absolutely. I'm very excited. I guess to kind of get things started, what first drew you into the Gothic and paranormal genres? Was there any sort of experience or formative story that kind of influenced you and set you on the path?
Great question. Yes, my first ghost story happened when I was about 6 years old, and it was at the passing of my great grandmother, who I'm named for. There was a very uncanny experience that happened with me. I was actually very sick, and I had like 105-degree fever, which for a 6-year-old is really scary, potentially deadly. That broke at the time of her passing, and we got a phone call that all of this was at the same time, and I'm named for her. And I've always really felt that she was then a force watching over me, and still is a force watching over me. So for me, the concept of the story was because it was an unseen paranormal thing. There was some other sort of strange circumstances around me, and so I felt like, oh well, ghosts are just like potentially friends and family who are here to like watch over us. So in my childhood, my concept of a ghost story was mostly inclined to the concept of party people. So I was really interested in stories that like would reaffirm that. And one of the first ghost stories that I remember that was popular in culture and popular fiction was The Christmas Girl. And that's also culturally scary. So I guess scary at first, but there's something that was create a better world the character Scrooge. So for me, this concept of like, what do you mean ghosts are scary was an interesting thing for me as a child when I knew that for other people they were scary. So I would tell ghost stories to my Girl Scout troop because I like to scare them. But sometimes it would be like, yeah, but you just have to understand the ghosts and where they're coming from. So it was like it sort of became this like um translator of the ghost stories of like maybe the things that are scary are actually just misunderstood, and and you pair that with things like Scooby-Doo growing up, when it was actually humans that were the scary ones that were trying to, trick people. All of these things were feeding this little mind. And then around age 8 or 9, I had a teacher who just like handed me a collected works of Edgar Allan Poe and was like, "You're weird. You'll like this." So I was off to the races.
Sent off. That's fantastic. That I think that's such a cool kind of like upbringing, something that kind of stays with you. Because it doesn't have to be this big scary thing. It's just energy, and it's just, things that
Right.
to accompany us as the world goes on and such.
Absolutely. I love that's the thing for me about paranormal fiction is how can we take something that is traditionally used in a particular way for a particular effect, and how can we try to turn it on its head,
Mm.
and also just re-examine it, and but not to take away from the fact that things can be scary, and there's a sort of a function in that too. I think the things that do scare us and the things that draw me back into writing stories that have horror elements. Sometimes I'm writing things that are directly horror stories. In other cases, I'm writing my full length novels, a lot of horror elements, but ultimately sort of a resolution, a happy ending, kind of a brighter note to end on. But I think that horror can help us get through those moments, and so that's why I keep kind of coming back to the genre. And I like, working with Castlebridge Media has allowed me to do with the different Castle of Horror anthologies I've been a part of, all kinds of different ways in which we can address these bigger questions, and kind of play with them.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, kind of going into all of the hats that you wear as an actress, playwright, author, narrator, all of the above. Do you think these experiences have played a role in your writing, especially when you're crafting something with a certain atmosphere that you're trying to relay?
Absolutely, and that's a great question because I feel like the more immersive I can be, the better. Because I am thinking about the story as an actor, so I'm very character driven. All of my stories are very focused in on generally strong female characters or female characters who are trying to get their strength and regain their strength and their agency or their autonomy, especially because I'm writing a lot of period fiction. So if you're talking about a 19th century woman, she's trying to find her way in the world. And in that moment, especially late 19th century, which is where a lot of my books are set, these are women who are finding their way, in some cases, through paranormal means, because you have the rise of spiritualism. You have women who are being posited as mediums, whether they have any talent or not. That's left to be discovered over the course of the narrative sometimes. But I think that character driven idea of, like, if I'm in this world, how am I, as a performer, as someone who's interested in this time period, paralleling our current time period, because there's a lot of things of the late 19th century that we're reliving right now, economically, in terms of class struggles, in terms of trying to fight for rights, things like that. There's a lot of really difficult parallels. So writing about the 19th century is sometimes writing about right now, and those kinds of struggles, and how can we try to create a better society, as a lot of these people were trying to figure out then, trying to figure it out now, and what can be the most welcoming and inclusive society. I mean, that's the one I want to be in. So in that, all of this is okay. How do I, as a performer, address this? How do I, as a narrator, how would I want to tell this story if I didn't have a page and I were just entertaining people in front of an audience, just in the old, oral storyteller days? How am I painting the picture if I were filming this as a film actor? How would I set that stage? So I think the more different ways you can come at storytelling, from the most sensory aspects, and thinking about it from every single angle, both inhabiting it as a performer, seeing it, envisioning it as a director, all that theatrical experience that I have from my professional work in theater and on stage and in film, that definitely informs how I'm looking at the full picture when I'm writing it out. And so it's different. You do have to shift your mindset, because obviously a screenplay looks very different than the narrative of a novel is. But some of the ways in which you decide to tell the story and where you decide to start, all of those things, the more different angles you can look at it, the more options you have as a storyteller. So when I'm giving workshops, I'll tell people to look at something from a different artistic angle. Think about it like a playwright. Think about it like a film director, and maybe you will unstick yourself from a sticking point in your drafting process too.
Totally, that I think that makes perfect sense because you're seeing it from all of the different angles. So you kind of have this like 360 bird's eye of how this can be portrayed or kind of taken in. And I think in that light too, do you think like what do you think really draws readers and like you as a writer to haunted history in particular, or kind of that genre of time, that time period? Do you think it's maybe like the mystery, the emotion, perhaps something, how I know you kind of talked parallels as well. Do you think that kind of plays into everything and what you want to get from readers when they read your work?
All of that's a great question too, because I think that, yeah, the immersive quality is really, really important for me. Setting the stage, the atmosphere, drawing people in. I think when you talk about haunted spaces, people do have a certain expectation. So you really do have to set the stage for the haunted narrative. Even if over the course of like our nonfiction that I've co-written with Andrea James, starting with A Haunted History of Invisible Women, True Stories of America's Ghosts. With this, we are in some cases debunking some haunted houses, but you still have to set the stage. You still have to set the expectation for the haunting and draw people into the narrative and why anyone should care. And it is about the narrative. It's what stories are being told, especially in the case of A Haunted History of Invisible Women. We're asking the question, how do we talk about women alive and dead? What are the narratives that are constructed by the women themselves in their lives, if they were able to, especially when you're talking about historic women? Historically, were not always able to write their own narrative. If they appeared in print or were noted in the history books, it was sometimes rare. Just finding them genealogically, because of trying to find maiden names, is very difficult sometimes historically. So you have all of these obstacles to get to the real history. And in the cases of some of the haunted history, some of those narratives really got taken away from them, and sort of all of these myths were put upon them, even in the time of their actual lives or deaths, like in the case of the Salem witch trials, when these women were not witches. They were just average. They would have considered themselves Christians at the time. They just were maligned by society. They were targeted. They were persecuted because they were either poor or widowed or some other marginalization within society, or in some cases just kind of cantankerous, and or had a lot of land that the that the owner that the city officials wanted to take at the time. So there's all of these, what do we think of the narrative is, oh, it was a big witch trial when it was all really more of a power grab. Okay, telling the reality of the stories when real people's lives are hanging in the balance. We hope that there can be a little bit of can we learn from history to try to not subscribe to mob mentality, to try to not get caught up in hysteria about things? And so I think that there can be these other functions that you can wrap yourself into the narrative, especially with the narrative nonfiction. You need to actually tell a good story. It can't just all be facts. It can't necessarily be, this is not an academic text. We're not college professors. We are tour guides. And I work as a tour guide, and I've worked as a tour guide in all different places around the country in my past, specifically in haunted locations. You got to be able to draw people into the story, and then pepper in the facts as you go. And in fiction and nonfiction, both of these things are true, in that you have to create a relatable story. And so for me, the way in is always character. If I can create a character that is sort of the point of view character for the reader, and hopefully I can craft something that will be evocative to the reader, that will make them empathize with the situation, or if they can't empathize because it's too far outside of their experience, really explain the situation and really, really set the stage so that someone can come into that very foreign experience for them, and have something that they feel can expand their own understanding of what it's like to be human. And I think that, ghost stories really say more about the living than they do about the dead often, because we're still telling these ghost stories as a way for us to get right with our own fears about death. And that's why ghost stories throughout all of human history, in and these vary, of course, culturally. So what is a ghost story for one culture is going to be something very different for another culture, if even the concept of ghosts even track. In some cultures don't even think about it that way. They're just going to think about, these are the ancestors who were always with you. So I think that, it's also our job as storytellers to make sure, if we're in different cultural contexts, that we're dealing with those things sensitively and appropriately as well, with a lot of due diligence, a lot of due research, and conversation with people from those backgrounds too. But all this to say, I think that the concept of the unknown, no matter where you are, is something that's of interest. And so here we are in a haunted narrative, hopefully, telling an entertaining story, but there's always a bigger picture of that sort of existential question. And that's really what keeps driving me.
Yeah, what that was a beautiful way to put it. I think especially in terms of like people's cultures and how identities kind of lean into those, I think it is so important to honor those in the way that's most appropriate, and doing that in a way that, makes sense and does, you know, teach that to everyone. Do you think your process has changed over time as you've kind of moved between fiction and nonfiction and even going into narration and things like that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because it's something that I've only just really begun to have a track record of now, because Haunted History of Invisible Women came out in 2022, and our follow-up, which is called America's Most Gothic: Haunted History Stranger Than Fiction, that's coming out in September of 2025. And so it's been these several years of crafting intensely researched narratives, and really it does come down to just got to tell a good story, and try to get people into the moment as quickly as possible, in a way that feels authentic and doesn't feel overblown. You got to strike the right balance. You can't, in any kind of paranormal fiction, you don't want it to come across like a B movie. You want it to be something that people can really feel their way through without going into pure camp. So that's a tricky thing, but I think that both, I'm in a rare situation where my fiction and my nonfiction directly feed each other. In the case of the next Castle of Horror anthology coming out at the beginning of May here, with the Ripped from the Headlines anthology, I got the idea for that story from an actual chapter I wrote in America's Most Gothic, because this man stole this woman's corpse, and it's this really uh, ugly, harrowing, gross, and also really entitled story of this guy who just thought he had the right to just desecrate this corpse and just like take her in it. And he thought he was being romantic, and it's like, no, dude, that is That is not. That is weird and creepy and terrible, and her family is not okay with any of this, and it's just and I was so upset by it, that I had to, like, write a story to bring justice to a guy who never faced justice because at the time he did go to trial for it, but it was past the statute of limitations that he'd lived with a corpse bride for like 9 years. So, and all of this is real history, and it just I was describing this whole thing to friends of mine, and they're like, "Oh, this is for your fiction, right?" I'm like, "No, actually, the story this is based on is actually for the nonfiction." And they're like, "Oh my god." So, really stranger than fiction in this. So in these cases, I feel like the fiction and the nonfiction, there's in some cases barely a line, but I need to create a fictional construct by which I could see this man face justice. So that's the power of story, is that we can look at a real historical event and we can reimagine it in a way that and I usually bring the way that I bring a resolution to something is usually spectral. It's usually a ghost that sort of brings a certain reckoning force to a situation. And that was a way that I could sort of sleep at night after, needing to kind of, clean my whole brain after these things. So that is an exciting way in which I'm trying to look for the parallels between fiction and nonfiction, but being crystal clear about what is an invention and what is a real story. So there's a very clear author's note at the end that the ghost by which I am telling this story is my construct from my own Germanic heritage from the 19th century. My family emigrated over, and so they were kind of coming from the Black Forest region, which is an interesting region of Germany and like has a lot of old folkloric things to it. So I'm bringing that to bear in this particular way, pulling from my own culture to sort of punish this other German immigrant who was like, making our people look real bad in the 1930s, let alone everything else. So it's like, it's, I think there's such a power in what we can do with both fiction and nonfiction, as long as you're being very clear with your audience about which is which, because that I do think it is our duty to make sure that if we are telling a real story, that there is respect for the dead first and foremost. So that's a general rule, both with the ghost tour company I work with, Burrows of the Dead in New York, founded by Andrea James, my co-author. That respect for the dead is first and foremost, because we are talking about real history, and a lot of times real history is real ugly and it's really complicated. It's violent, it's bloody, it's unfair, and so we have to have that. We have to grapple with that and talk with that in a way that is not incendiary or not trying to be like trading on someone else's trauma for the jump scare. That's a tricky thing. So those kinds of lines are something I'm always thinking about balancing, and trying when I'm getting people wrapped up in stuff. I want people to get wrapped up in the concept of our own anxieties of mortality rather than it being at someone else's expense. So those are tricky dynamics to manage, but ones I think are really important. And also, I think if you're doing it well, it can be actually really exciting because we're putting ourselves in that careful precipice between life and death. And in that we're doing it safely. That's why horror is so great as a genre, because it's letting us exercise our fears, both exorcise and exercise in terms of like going through something that might be our biggest fears. Can we work through these things and come out on the other side? Nightmares are maybe supposed to be sort of like ways in which our brain problem solves scenarios. How would I get out of the haunted house I'm trapped in? So I think that all of those things can serve a really good purpose. So I try to think about all of those things when I'm writing, but at the end of the day, you get bogged down if you think about the big picture when you're just trying to draft.
Yeah.
So there's a certain amount of like when you're just trying to do the draft, just focus on what's the task at hand right now. And for me, it all goes back to character. What would this character, as if I'm playing this on stage, if I'm in the head and heart of this character, what would they do next? And that's how I get from point A to point B.
Totally. Do you think there's any kind of as we close out, do you think there's any advice that you wish you had for yourself or maybe emerging writers who want to kind of explore this fiction genre, especially in paranormal or gothic storytelling that you would kind of put out into the world?
Yeah, I think in terms of just publishing in general, just realize it's a really long game. I just recently got an audiobook sale for books of mine that came out 12 years ago. And so the publisher never used the audio rights at that time, but 12 years later, with a renewed interest in Gothic fiction, a renewed interest in romantic fantasy and things like that, my young adult series is getting an audio edition 12 years later. So I think, like, realize that publishing is a long game, stay with it, stay in it, and just keep doing your thing, and keep writing, because it's a difficult industry, and it is one that you do need to have a love for it, because it will break your heart a lot, as much as it will as much as you love the craft, and anything worth doing is often difficult. And the publishing industry has changed a lot since I first debuted in 2009. It's just lots of changes, and changes ahead still. But as long as you're still, just trying to get work out as best as you can, and working with people that you like to work with. It's definitely why I come back to Castlebridge, because it's like these are folks I've worked with now for years, and I come back to working with them because I enjoy that process. And we all have the same love of story at heart. And so, for folks who are interested in paranormal things, in terms of Gothic fiction, things like that, really let yourself immerse. Really, it is an immersive genre. So, really let yourself just, like, run from the haunted house in your mind. Like, really let yourself sort of, yeah, abandon the pretense. Let yourself get really emotionally invested. It's a genre of big emotions, a lot of psychological focus. So really let yourself explore what that would mean to you. Really break down any kind of boundaries that you have, but definitely do your research. If it is a haunted location, realize that there's a lot of things that are just made up, because the people don't expect haunted tourism or haunted places to have accurate history. But that's something that Andrea and I, as authors, are passionate about having as accurate history as we are able to find. Some cases we're like, we don't know. There's a report that keeps cropping up. We don't know what the original source was, but we can't verify it. I mean, and that's the thing with paranormal stuff. You can't. It's ultimately not proven yet. Maybe science will get there. I don't think the science and paranormal are antithetical. I think they're all probably part of something we just don't understand yet. But so in terms of, I definitely think with anything with writing, do your research. If you're dealing with a cultural tradition that is not your own, get a sensitivity reader, talk to people, do your research there, because that is something that, like, if you're dealing with someone else's, like, sacred practices, that be very careful, be very respectful. And also just realize that this is, if you're dealing with paranormal stuff, there is a spiritual element to it. So just make sure that you are, like, taking your own care of yourself through all of that, and then to just have fun with it. That's the most important thing, really, at the end of the day, is to have fun with it, and also to just make sure that you are having fun, but again, not at the expense of someone else. That's really, especially right now, we're in a very divisive time right now. And so operating with a certain amount of love and kindness and respect in all things, I think, is a bit of a rule that I just want to put out there in the world.
Absolutely. I think that should be a no-brainer for everyone. I hope we all get there. I think to kind of wrap everything up, where can listeners kind of keep up with latest releases and events? I know we were talking about some projects coming out in May. We have some exciting stuff. Where can we kind of recap all of that so we know going forward?
I am on all the social medias. So if you look at Leanna Renee Hieber, at all of I'm on all social media. I don't check every social media every day. I can't, because I'm on deadlines, and I don't want to doom scroll. So I monitor how often I'm online or not. But you can find me across social media, and that's where you'll get the updates about things. I do send out a newsletter, so you can find a newsletter on my website. I only send a newsletter out when it is the time for either pre-ordering a new release, or it's actually a new release. So you maybe only get a few emails a year. So I promise to not spam people. But yeah, definitely, all the social medias, and I do love to interact with people. If you read something and you want to ask a question about it, I do love hearing from readers. So don't hesitate to reach out, and I will get back to you, folks. I promise.
Amazing. Well, this was fantastic. You are such a light. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you. You too.
I feel like I learned so much. I'm sure everyone else will be so excited to hear all of the process and kind of all of this, that what it means to you as well. I think that's so important.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your time and thanks for the wide range of
Absolutely.
questions. I really appreciate this.
Absolutely. Well, I'm sure I'll be hearing from you and keeping my eye out for everything that comes out going forward and excited to see what comes next.
Thank you.
Amazing. Well, have a great night and
You
we'll talk
too.
soon.
Thanks.
Have a good one.
You too.